At 74, Harold Whitman's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the barber chair's worn leather armrests, his face contorting in sudden agony. The sharp hiss that escaped his lips cut through the familiar hum of Marcus Thompson's barber shop like a blade through silence. What Marcus discovered beneath those silver strands wasn't just a bump. It was a death sentence that had been growing unnoticed for months. The scissors clattered to the checkered floor as Marcus stumbled backward, his face draining of color. Old Frank Morrison's newspaper rustled to the ground, forgotten. The entire barber shop held its breath. Eleanor had kissed Harold goodbye that morning, the same tender kiss she'd given him for 52 years, never knowing it might be among their last. The headaches Harold had dismissed as getting old suddenly made terrifying sense. "Call 911, Marcus whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking with urgency. "Call them now!" But how long had Harold been dying while doctors dismissed his pain as normal aging? And would anyone listen to an old man's cries for help before it was too late? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millbrook, Ohio had always been the kind of place where a man's word meant something and neighbors still waved from their front porches. Population 23,000, most of whom had worked at Millbrook Steel at some point in their lives. It was a town built on the backbone of honest labor and genuine community. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and a handshake still sealed a deal. Harold Whitman embodied everything Millbrook stood for. At 74, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent 45 years as a foreman at the steel mill, earning the respect of every worker who had ever served under him. His calloused hands told the story of a lifetime spent building America's infrastructure, one blueprint at a time. Those same hands had built the house on Maple Street where he and Eleanor had raised their son David, where they'd celebrated countless birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings over coffee and the newspaper. Eleanor Whitman at 72 was Harold's perfect complement. Where he was reserved, she was warmly talkative. Where he worried silently, she faced problems head-on with the practical wisdom of a woman who had spent 35 years as the school nurse at Millbrook Elementary. She knew how to comfort scraped knees and broken hearts alike, and her kitchen had been the unofficial counseling center for half the neighborhood's children over the decades. Her graying brown hair was always neatly pinned, her apron perpetually dusted with flour from whatever comfort food she was preparing for someone in need. Their son David, now 48, lived in San Francisco working as a software engineer. The distance between Ohio and California felt like more than just miles. It represented the generational gap between Harold's world of tangible steel and David's world of invisible code. Phone calls came monthly, visits twice a year if they were lucky, and while Harold was proud of his son's success, he couldn't shake the feeling that David lived in a world he barely understood. Thompson's traditional barber shop sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, its red, white, and blue pole spinning lazily in the afternoon sun. Marcus Thompson, 38, was the third generation of his family to wield scissors and razors in that same location. His grandfather had cut hair for the mill workers in the 1940s. His father had trimmed the locks of their sons in the 70s and 80s, and now Marcus continued the tradition. The shop hadn't changed much. Black and white checkered floors, 4 vintage barber chairs with worn leather seats, and walls lined with photographs of Millbrook's history. For 8 years, Harold had occupied the second chair from the window every Wednesday at 2 p.m. sharp. It was more than just a haircut. It was a ritual, a connection to a community that understood the value of consistency and tradition. Marcus had learned Harold's life story one snippet at a time: the early marriage to Eleanor, the pride in David's education, the satisfaction of a career well lived, and lately the quiet fears that came with fixed income and aging bodies. Neither man could have imagined that their weekly ritual would soon uncover a conspiracy of neglect that reached far beyond the barbershop's familiar walls. It started on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months before Marcus would make his terrifying discovery. Harold Whitman sat at his kitchen table at 5:30 a.m., following the same routine he'd maintained for the past 2 years of retirement. Coffee first, black, no sugar, then the morning paper spread across the yellow formica surface that Eleanor had picked out in 1987. The familiar ritual of reading the sports section first, then local news, then the obituaries, to see who else from his generation had passed on. That's when the pain struck. It came like a lightning bolt behind his left ear, sharp and sudden enough to make him gasp and drop his coffee cup. The ceramic mug, one of a set Eleanor had bought for their 40th anniversary, shattered against the linoleum floor, sending hot coffee splashing across his work boots. "Harold?" Eleanor's voice called from upstairs, where she was getting dressed for another day of what she told him was visiting friends, though Harold suspected she was working part-time somewhere to supplement their meager Social Security income. "I'm fine, dear," Harold called back, his voice steadier than he felt. The pain lasted exactly 47 seconds. He knew because he'd instinctively looked at the kitchen clock, the way a man who'd spent decades timing industrial processes tends to do. When it subsided, he was left with a strange, tingling sensation and the unsettling feeling that something fundamental had just changed in his carefully ordered world. He cleaned up the mess before Eleanor came downstairs, not wanting to worry her. At breakfast, she noticed the missing mug but accepted his explanation about clumsiness. "Getting old ain't for sissies," he said with a forced chuckle, repeating the phrase his own father had used when Harold was young and impatient with the elderly. But over the next 2 weeks, the pattern emerged. Every 3 or 4 days, always in the same spot behind his left ear, the pain would strike without warning. Sometimes it happened while he was reading, sometimes while working in his small garage workshop, sometimes while watching the evening news with Eleanor. Each episode lasted between 30 and 60 seconds, then vanished completely, leaving him feeling foolish for worrying about something so brief. Harold began carrying a small bottle of Tylenol in his shirt pocket, taking 2 pills whenever he felt the pain coming on. He told himself it was nothing, probably just stress from adjusting to retirement, or maybe tension from sleeping wrong. He'd worked in a steel mill for 45 years. His body had earned a few aches and pains. The first crack in his stoic facade came during his Wednesday appointment at Marcus's barbershop. Harold had been going to Thompson's Traditional for 8 years, ever since Marcus had taken over from his father. It was more than just a haircut. It was his weekly connection to the community, a chance to catch up with other retirees and discuss everything from the weather to the state of the world. "You seem tired lately, Mr. Whitman," Marcus observed as he draped the familiar striped cloth around Harold's shoulders. Marcus had the kind of observational skills that came from years of listening to people's stories while wielding sharp instruments near their heads. He noticed things. The way Harold's hands trembled slightly when he gripped the chair arms, the way he rubbed behind his left ear when he thought no one was looking. "Age ain't for sissies, son," Harold replied, using his standard deflection. But something in Marcus's kind eyes made him want to say more. "Been getting some headaches lately. Probably just need new glasses or something." Marcus nodded thoughtfully as he began cutting Harold's silver hair with practiced precision. "My grandmother used to get headaches when she was worried about something. Said they were her body's way of telling her to pay attention." Harold appreciated that Marcus didn't dismiss his concerns the way younger people often did with the elderly. There was respect in the young barber's manner, a recognition that Harold's years had earned him the right to be taken seriously. But as the weeks passed, the headaches grew more frequent and intense. Harold found himself dropping things. His coffee cup became a regular casualty, and sometimes he'd lose his train of thought mid-sentence. Eleanor noticed, of course. After 52 years of marriage, she could read his moods better than he could read his own. "Harold Whitman, you're going to see Doc Wells," she announced one evening in early May, using the tone that had settled arguments throughout their marriage. "Ellie, it's just getting old. The woman's got better things to do than listen to an old man complain about headaches. The woman has been our family doctor for 15 years, and she gets paid to listen to old men complain about headaches," Eleanor shot back. "Besides, I already made the appointment. Thursday at 10. Dr. Patricia Wells had been their physician since the previous doctor retired, and Harold generally liked her competent, no-nonsense approach. But their appointment on that Thursday morning left him feeling diminished and unheard in ways he'd never experienced before. The waiting room was packed with people who looked younger and sicker than him, and Harold began to feel guilty for taking up valuable time with what might be nothing more than the normal complaints of aging. When they were finally called back, 2.5 hours after their scheduled appointment, Dr. Wells looked harried and rushed. "What brings you in today, Mr. Whitman?" she asked, barely looking up from her computer screen as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Harold described his symptoms carefully, the way he'd once reported mechanical problems to plant supervisors, precise, factual, without unnecessary drama. The location of the pain, its frequency, its duration, the way it seemed to be getting worse over time. Dr. Wells nodded absently, still typing. "Mr. Whitman, at your age, aches and pains are unfortunately normal. Have you been stressed about retirement? Many men find the transition from working life to retirement more difficult than they expect. Doc, these headaches are different from anything I've had before," Harold insisted, feeling his frustration rise. "And they're getting worse." "I understand your concern," Dr. Wells said, finally looking at him directly. "But headaches are incredibly common, especially in older adults. Your blood pressure is good, your reflexes are normal, and you don't show any signs of serious neurological issues. I'd recommend taking ibuprofen instead of Tylenol. It's better for inflammation. And try to reduce your caffeine intake. Sometimes retirement can disrupt sleep patterns." Harold wanted to explain that he'd been sleeping fine, that his caffeine intake hadn't changed, that something genuinely felt wrong in his body. But Dr. Wells was already standing, hand on the door handle, ready to move on to the next patient. "If the headaches persist or worsen significantly, give us a call," she said over her shoulder as she left the room. The visit cost $200, a significant chunk of their monthly budget, for what amounted to 10 minutes of dismissal. As they walked to their car, Harold felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same frustration he'd felt in his working days when supervisors made decisions without consulting the men who actually knew the equipment. "She didn't listen, Ellie," he said quietly as Eleanor unlocked their 15-year-old Honda Civic. "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with her own frustration. "Maybe we need to try someone else." But Harold was already retreating into the resigned acceptance that too many elderly Americans know too well. Maybe he was just getting old. Maybe this was what the rest of his life would feel like. A series of dismissals and diminishments until he simply faded away. He had no way of knowing that the pain behind his ear was his body's desperate attempt to warn him about something that would soon threaten everything he held dear. 6 weeks after Dr. Wells dismissed Harold's concerns with a prescription for acceptance and ibuprofen, Eleanor Whitman reached her breaking point. She'd watched her husband of 52 years transform from a confident, capable man into someone who winced when he thought she wasn't looking, who started sentences and forgot how to finish them, who gripped the arms of his favorite recliner until his knuckles went white during what he still insisted were just headaches. The final straw came on a humid Tuesday evening in June when Harold collapsed in their kitchen while reaching for a glass of water. Not dramatically. Harold never did anything dramatically, but with the quiet, frightening surrender of a man whose body was finally admitting defeat. Eleanor found him sitting on the linoleum floor, back against the refrigerator, looking more confused than hurt. "I just got dizzy for a second," he said, but his voice carried a tremor she'd never heard before. "That's it," Eleanor announced with the fierce determination that had gotten her through 4 decades of dealing with injured children and worried parents. "We're getting that MRI." The next morning, Eleanor called their insurance company with the systematic patience of a woman who had once managed the medical needs of 400 elementary school children. What followed was a 3-hour odyssey through automated phone systems, transfers to departments that didn't exist, and conversations with representatives who seemed trained to exhaust callers into submission. "Medicare Advantage Customer Service, this is Jennifer. How can I help you today?" "I need to get pre-authorization for an MRI for my husband," Eleanor said, her notebook ready to document every detail of the conversation. "I can help you with that. Can you provide the member ID number?" 45 minutes later, after being transferred 4 times and having to repeat Harold's information to each new representative, Eleanor found herself speaking to someone named Derek in the Senior Care Authorization Department. "Mrs. Whitman, I see here that your husband is 74 years old, is that correct?" "Yes. And he's been having severe headaches that are getting worse. His doctor thinks an MRI would be helpful." "I understand your concern, ma'am, but Policy 47B states that neurological imaging for patients over 70 requires documentation of seizure activity, stroke symptoms, or significant cognitive decline as verified by standardized testing." Eleanor felt her blood pressure rising. "His age demographic? He's a human being with a medical problem." "I understand this is frustrating, ma'am, but these guidelines exist to prevent unnecessary procedures and control healthcare costs." "Has your husband experienced any loss of consciousness, paralysis, or documented memory loss?" "He collapsed yesterday," Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice level. "Was this witnessed by a medical professional? Do you have documentation of the incident?" "It happened in our kitchen. Of course it wasn't witnessed by a medical professional." The conversation continued in circles for another hour. Derek explained that Harold could certainly pay for the MRI out of pocket, only $3,200, or they could begin the appeals process, which typically took 6 to 8 weeks to resolve. Eleanor hung up feeling like she'd been trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare designed to wear down elderly people until they simply gave up and went away. That evening, Harold found Eleanor crying at the kitchen table, surrounded by insurance paperwork and medical bills that already totaled over $800 for visits that had provided no answers and no relief. "Ellie, what's all this?" Harold asked, though he already knew. The stack of denial letters, explanation of benefits forms, and appeal documents told the story of their healthcare system's systematic failure to care for its aging population. "They won't pay for the MRI," Eleanor said without looking up. "They say you're too old to justify the expense unless you have a stroke first." Harold sat down heavily in the chair across from her. The same chair where he'd read the morning paper for 30 years, where he'd helped David with homework, where he'd shared countless quiet conversations with the woman he loved more than his own life. "Maybe we should just let it go," he said quietly. "Maybe this is just what getting old feels like." Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that blazed with a fury he'd rarely seen in their decades together. "Harold Whitman, don't you dare give up. You've worked 45 years, paid into this system, served your country, raised a good son, and been a pillar of this community. You deserve better than to be dismissed because some insurance company decided you're not worth the cost of a simple test." But even as she spoke, Eleanor was making calculations in her head. Harold's Social Security was $1,247 a month. Her own was $1,203, After their house payment, utilities, food, and medications, they had maybe $300 left each month. The MRI would cost more than 2 months of their disposable income, money they'd been saving for emergencies that now seemed quaint compared to this medical crisis. The next day, Eleanor took a step that would have horrified Harold if he'd known about it. She walked into Peterson's Market on 5th Street and asked Tom Peterson, whose own children she'd nursed through countless playground injuries, if he had any part-time work available. "Eleanor, you don't need to be working at your age," Tom said gently. "Besides, Harold would have my hide if he knew I put his wife to work." "Tom, I need this job," Eleanor said with quiet dignity. "And what Harold doesn't know won't hurt him." So Eleanor began working 20 hours a week at Peterson's Market, stocking shelves and running the register for $12 an hour. She told Harold she was visiting friends more often, taking longer walks, getting more involved with church activities. The deception ate at her. They'd never lied to each other about anything important in 52 years of marriage, but she couldn't see any other choice. Meanwhile, Harold was fighting his own battle with pride and practicality. The headaches were now coming daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and they were lasting longer. What had once been 47-second episodes were now stretching to 2 or 3 minutes of pain so intense it left him nauseated and disoriented. 2 weeks into Eleanor's secret employment, Harold made a decision that cost him most of his remaining dignity. He drove to the clinic in the next town over, hoping a different doctor might take his symptoms more seriously. Dr. Martinez was younger than Dr. Wells, fresh out of residency, and carried himself with the supreme confidence of someone who had never doubted his own judgment. "Let me guess," Dr. Martinez said before Harold had even finished describing his symptoms. "You've been researching your headaches on WebMD?" "Son, I've been alive longer than you've been breathing," Harold replied, his temper flaring. "I know the difference between normal aging and something being wrong with my body." "Mr. Whitman, age-related cognitive changes often cause health anxiety. What you're describing sounds like tension headaches, probably related to retirement adjustment disorder. Many men struggle with the loss of purpose and identity that comes with leaving the workforce." Harold wanted to explain that he'd actually enjoyed retirement, that he'd found purpose in his woodworking hobby and his volunteer work at the Veterans Center. But Dr. Martinez was already writing a prescription. "I'm recommending a course of meditation and acceptance therapy," the young doctor said. "There's a senior center in Millbrook that offers classes specifically designed for older adults dealing with the psychological challenges of aging." The visit cost another $180 and left Harold feeling more frustrated and unheard than ever. On the drive home, he and Eleanor had their first real fight in years. "They're treating you like you're already dead," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger. "Maybe I should be," Harold replied, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. Eleanor pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face her husband fully. "Harold Whitman, don't you ever say that again. You're not giving up, and neither am I. We're going to figure this out." That evening, Harold made the phone call he'd been dreading. David answered on the 3rd ring, and Harold could hear the sounds of his busy California life in the background. Television, children's voices, the general chaos of modern family living. "Dad, this is a surprise. How are you and Mom doing?" "Son, I hate to bother you," Harold began, and immediately David's tone changed. "Dad, you're not bothering me. What's going on?" Harold tried to explain about the headaches, the doctor's dismissals, the insurance battles, but he could hear David getting distracted by something happening in his house. "Hold on, Dad. Madison just spilled juice all over her homework and Sarah's having a meltdown about her science project. Can I call you back later?" "Sure, son." "It's nothing urgent." But David never called back, and Harold didn't have the heart to try again. For the first time in his adult life, Harold Whitman felt truly alone with his problems. That night, as Eleanor quietly calculated how many more shifts she'd have to work to afford the MRI, and Harold lay awake wondering if his pain was real or just the inevitable surrender of an aging body, neither of them could have imagined that help would come from the most unexpected source: a barber's trained eye and a community's refusal to let one of their own suffer in silence. The next 4 weeks leading up to that fateful Wednesday in July transformed Thompson's traditional barbershop into something unprecedented in its 70-year history, an unofficial headquarters for elderly healthcare advocacy. It started small, as most revolutions do, with quiet conversations between men who had built America's infrastructure and now found themselves dismissed by the very systems they had helped create. Marcus Thompson had always prided himself on running more than just a barber shop. Like his father and grandfather before him, he understood that his real job wasn't cutting hair, it was listening. But as Harold's condition visibly deteriorated over those 4 weeks, Marcus found himself in territory no barber school had prepared him for, watching a good man slowly crumble under the weight of medical neglect and bureaucratic indifference. Harold's Wednesday appointments became increasingly difficult to witness. The man who had once sat straight and proud in the vintage leather chair now gripped the armrests like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. His hands, once steady enough to read blueprints and guide steel beams into place, trembled as he signed his name in Marcus's appointment book. Most troubling of all were the moments when Harold would stop mid-sentence, his eyes going distant and confused, as if searching for words that had suddenly vanished from his vocabulary. "It's getting worse, isn't it, Mr. Whitman?" Marcus asked during the second Wednesday of July, gently combing Harold's silver hair while trying to hide his concern. "Some days are better than others," Harold replied, but his voice carried a defeated quality that Marcus had never heard before. "Eleanor keeps pushing for more tests, but the insurance—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Frank Morrison, Harold's contemporary who occupied the chair next to him every Wednesday, looked up from his copy of the Millbrook Gazette. "Harold, what's this about insurance? You having problems?" What followed was Harold's reluctant confession about the previous months. The escalating headaches, the dismissive doctors, the insurance company's refusal to authorize an MRI, Eleanor's secret job that she thought he didn't know about. By the time Harold finished speaking, the barber shop had gone completely quiet except for the gentle hum of Marcus's electric clippers. "Doc told me my back pain is normal for 78, Frank said bitterly. 43 years I worked construction, and now when I can barely get out of bed some mornings, they act like I'm being dramatic." "Same here," added Pete Sullivan from the waiting area. "Chest pains that feel like someone's sitting on my ribs, but the cardiologist says it's probably just anxiety about aging." Anxiety? "I stormed the beaches at Normandy when I was 19, but now I'm supposed to be anxious about a little chest pain?" As the stories poured out, Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. A generation of men who had rarely complained about anything finally admitting that the healthcare system was failing them systematically. These weren't whiners or hypochondriacs. These were the men who had built the interstate highway system, won World War II, and raised the baby boom generation. If they said something was wrong with their bodies, something was wrong. "This isn't right," Marcus said quietly, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Mr. Whitman, you've got more knowledge about structural engineering in your little finger than that young doctor has about medicine. If you say something's wrong, then something's wrong." Over the following days, Marcus found himself researching healthcare advocacy for seniors, staying up late after closing the shop to read about Medicare limitations, age discrimination in medical settings, and the systematic dismissal of elderly patients' complaints. What he discovered made him angry in ways he hadn't experienced since his father's death from a heart attack that 3 different doctors had initially dismissed as indigestion. The barbershop began to transform into an informal meeting place for Millbrook's elderly residents. Word spread through the community networks that connected seniors. The coffee clatch at Peterson's Market, the early morning walkers at Mill Creek Park, the regulars at Sacred Heart's weekday mass. Men and women began stopping by Thompson's not just for haircuts, but to share their own stories of medical dismissal and insurance battles. Ruth Patterson, 81, had been told her severe joint pain was normal wear and tear, despite the fact that she could barely open jars anymore. Bill Kowalski, 79, had been experiencing dizzy spells that his doctor attributed to inner ear issues related to aging, without ever actually examining his inner ear. Mary Chen, 73, had been dealing with persistent fatigue that multiple doctors had dismissed as depression, despite her insistence that she had never felt depressed in her life. Marcus began keeping a notebook, documenting these stories with the methodical precision his grandfather had once used to track inventory and appointments. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with the information, but his instincts told him that these individual cases of neglect were part of a larger pattern that needed to be exposed. Meanwhile, Harold's financial crisis was deepening into something that threatened to destroy everything he and Eleanor had built together. The medical bills, even for the dismissive consultations, had already cost them over $2,200. Eleanor's secret job at Peterson's Market was bringing in just enough to cover the additional expenses, but Harold had begun to suspect something was different about her daily routine. "Ellie, you seem tired lately," Harold observed one evening as they sat watching the news together. Eleanor had been working a particularly long shift that day, stocking heavy boxes of canned goods and dealing with the endless stream of customers who remembered her as the school nurse who had bandaged their children's wounds and comforted their fears. "Just getting older, I suppose," Eleanor replied, but she couldn't quite meet his eyes. The deception was killing her almost as much as Harold's illness. In 52 years of marriage, they had never kept significant secrets from each other. She justified it by telling herself it was temporary, just until they could afford the MRI and get some real answers about Harold's condition, but Harold was nobody's fool. A man doesn't spend 45 years managing steel mill operations without developing a keen eye for when things don't add up. Eleanor's increased absences, her mysterious errands, the new clothes she claimed came from church sales but still had store tags. It all pointed to the conclusion that his wife was working to pay for his medical care. The realization hit him one evening when he found Eleanor's work schedule tucked behind their grocery list on the refrigerator. She was working 20 hours a week at Peterson's Market for $12 an hour, money that was going straight toward the medical bills he had been too proud to let her worry about. The knowledge that his 72-year-old wife was stocking shelves and running cash registers to pay for his health care felt like a physical blow to his chest. That night, Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Eleanor slept beside him, and for the first time in his adult life, he wondered if dying might be the more honorable choice. He had always believed that a man's job was to provide for and protect his family. Now, his illness was forcing his elderly wife to work a job that was clearly taking a physical toll on her, all to pay for medical tests that might not even provide answers. The memory episodes were getting worse too, though Harold tried to hide them from Eleanor. Sometimes he would start a sentence and completely forget what he had intended to say. Other times, he would find himself standing in a room with no memory of why he had gone there. Most frightening of all were the moments when he would look at familiar objects, his coffee mug, his reading glasses, the framed photo of David's college graduation, and feel a momentary disconnect, as if he were seeing them for the first time. During his third Wednesday appointment in July, Harold made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. As Marcus carefully trimmed around his ears, Harold began talking about his fears in a way he had never done before, not even with Eleanor. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, Mr. Whitman. What's on your mind? If you knew you were becoming a burden to the people you loved most, would you keep fighting, or would you let go?" Marcus stopped cutting and moved around to face Harold directly. "Mr. Whitman, you are not a burden. You're a man who's built half the bridges in this county, who's raised a successful son, who's been married to the same woman for more than 50 years. You're not a burden. You're a treasure. But the money, the insurance fights, Eleanor working at her age, you know about that?" Harold nodded sadly. "She thinks she's protecting me, but I know. And it's killing me to watch her work so hard because our healthcare system has decided I'm not worth the cost of a simple test." Marcus set down his scissors and pulled up a chair next to Harold's. "Mr. Whitman, what if I told you that there might be another way? What if the problem isn't that you can't afford health care, but that the health care you're getting isn't good enough?" Over the next 20 minutes, Marcus shared what he had learned from his research about healthcare advocacy, about patient rights, about the systematic bias against elderly patients that pervaded American medicine. He told Harold about online communities of families who had fought insurance denials and won, about advocacy organizations that helped seniors navigate the complex medical system, about doctors who specialized in geriatric care and actually listened to their patients. "The thing is," Marcus said, "you need someone in your corner who understands the system and isn't afraid to fight it. Someone who can make them take you seriously." "And where exactly would I find someone like that?" Harold asked with a bitter laugh. "You're looking at him," Marcus replied. "Mr. Whitman, you've been coming to this shop for 8 years. You've treated me with more respect and kindness than most people show their own family members. You've listened to my problems, given me advice, supported my business through good times and bad. Now it's my turn to support you." Harold felt tears threatening for the first time in years. "Son, I appreciate that. But you're a barber, not a medical advocate." "Maybe so, but I've got something those doctors don't have. I believe you when you say something's wrong, and I've got time to make phone calls, do research, and raise hell until someone listens." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Frank Morrison and Pete Sullivan, who had begun timing their visits to coincide with Harold's appointments. As the three elderly men shared their latest experiences with medical dismissal and insurance battles, Marcus made a decision that would transform not just Harold's situation, but the entire dynamic of healthcare advocacy in Millbrook. "Gentlemen," Marcus announced, "I think it's time we stopped complaining and started fighting back." What Marcus proposed was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. Thompson's traditional barber shop would become an unofficial headquarters for senior healthcare advocacy. Marcus would use his business connections, his research skills, and his reputation in the community to help elderly residents navigate the medical system and fight insurance denials. The barbershop's comfortable chairs and familiar atmosphere would serve as a meeting place where seniors could share information, support each other, and plan strategies for getting the health care they deserved. "We'll call it the Gray Panthers," Frank suggested with a grin that made him look 20 years younger. "How about the Silver Brigade?" Pete countered. "Gentlemen," Harold said, speaking with more authority than he had shown in months, "let's call ourselves what we are. Americans who've earned the right to be heard." The plan they developed over the next week was both practical and subversive. Marcus would use his shop as a base of operations, making phone calls to insurance companies, researching doctors who specialized in geriatric care, and connecting seniors with advocacy resources. The elderly customers would share information about their experiences with different doctors and insurance companies, creating an informal database of which medical professionals actually listened to older patients and which ones simply went through the motions. Most importantly, they would attend each other's medical appointments as advocates and witnesses. The dismissive attitudes that doctors showed to isolated elderly patients might change dramatically when those patients arrived with articulate, determined advocates who refused to be brushed off. Eleanor discovered the barbershop revolution on a Thursday evening when she arrived to pick up Harold from what she thought was a routine haircut. Instead, she found the shop filled with a dozen senior citizens engaged in intense discussion about Medicare appeals processes and patient rights legislation. "Harold Whitman, what on earth is going on here?" she asked. "Ellie," Harold said, rising from his chair with more energy than she had seen from him in months, "we're going to war." As Marcus explained their plan to Eleanor, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold's symptoms began. Hope. For the first time in months, her husband looked like the man she had married, determined, purposeful, ready to fight for what was right. But even as the community rallied around Harold and began planning their assault on the healthcare system that had failed him, none of them could have predicted that the answer to Harold's medical mystery was growing larger and more dangerous every day, hidden beneath his silver hair where only the trained eye of a professional would be able to spot it. The barbershop revolution was about to face its first real test, and Marcus Thompson was about to discover that sometimes the most important diagnosis comes not from expensive medical equipment, but from someone who cares enough to look closely at what everyone else has missed. Wednesday, July 28th began like any other day in the Whitman household, but it would end with a discovery that changed everything. Harold woke at 5:15 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than usual, pulled from sleep by a headache so intense it felt like someone was driving railroad spikes through his skull. He lay in bed for 10 minutes, gripping the sheets and trying not to wake Eleanor before the pain subsided enough for him to function. By the time Eleanor came downstairs at 6:30, Harold had already broken 2 coffee mugs. His hands were shaking worse than ever, and was sitting at the kitchen table staring blankly at the morning paper without actually reading it. "Harold, you look terrible," Eleanor said, though her voice carried more determination than worry. The past week's barbershop revolution had given her something she'd lost during the months of medical dismissals, the belief that they could fight back and win. "Just tired, Ellie. Didn't sleep well." Eleanor studied her husband's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 35 years as a school nurse. His color was off, a grayish pallor that she'd seen before in children who were sicker than they appeared. His pupils seemed slightly dilated, and there was a tremor in his left hand that he was trying to hide by keeping it flat on the table. "Maybe you should cancel your appointment with Marcus today," she suggested. "No," Harold said with surprising firmness. "The Silver Brigade is meeting after my haircut. Frank's bringing those insurance appeal forms he got from his daughter-in-law who works at the hospital. We're making progress, Ellie. I'm not backing down now." The truth was that Harold's appointment at Thompson's Traditional had become the highlight of his week, the one place where he felt heard, valued, and actively engaged in fighting for his health rather than passively accepting decline. Marcus had transformed the barbershop into something Harold had never experienced in all his dealings with the medical establishment, a place where his symptoms were taken seriously and his concerns were met with action rather than dismissal. At 1:45 p.m., Harold walked the 6 blocks from his house to Main Street, moving more slowly than usual but determined to maintain his independence. The July heat was oppressive, and by the time he reached the barber shop, he was sweating more than the weather justified. Marcus noticed immediately. "Mr. Whitman, you okay? You look a little peaked." "Just hot out there," Harold replied. But as he settled into his usual chair, the second one from the window, He had to grip the armrests to steady himself. The familiar surroundings of the barber shop, with its black and white checkered floor and walls lined with photographs of Millbrook's history, usually calmed him. Today, everything seemed too bright, too loud, too intense. The Wednesday regulars were already gathered, Frank Morrison reading his paper in the chair next to Harold's, Pete Sullivan waiting his turn while studying the insurance form spread across the small table near the window, and Tom Chen, Mary's husband, who had started coming to the meetings even though he didn't need a haircut. "Gentlemen," Marcus announced as he draped the familiar striped cloth around Harold's shoulders, "I've got some good news. I spent 3 hours on the phone yesterday with a Medicare advocate in Columbus, and she thinks Harold's case is exactly the kind of thing that gets overturned on appeal." Harold tried to focus on Marcus's words, but the pain behind his left ear was building again, more intense than he'd ever experienced. He closed his eyes and concentrated on breathing steadily, the way Eleanor had taught him during her yoga phase 5 years ago. "The key," Marcus continued, carefully combing Harold's silver hair, "is documenting everything. Every symptom, every date, every interaction with doctors who dismissed your concerns. We're building a case that shows a pattern of inadequate care." As Marcus worked, he noticed something that made him pause. Harold's scalp, which he'd been examining more carefully each week since their advocacy campaign began, had what looked like a small raised area behind his left ear. Marcus had been cutting hair for 15 years, and he'd seen every kind of scalp condition imaginable, from simple dry skin to infected ingrown hairs to the occasional cyst. This was different. "Mr. Whitman, hold still for just a second," Marcus said, gently moving Harold's hair aside to get a better look at the area. "There's a little bump here I want to check." Harold's eyes snapped open. "What kind of bump?" "Probably nothing," Marcus said, but his trained fingers were already exploring the area with the gentle precision that came from years of working around people's heads and necks. The bump was roughly the size of a dime, raised and firm to the touch, with an irregular shape that set off every alarm bell in Marcus's professional experience. Frank looked up from his paper. "What's going on over there?" "Just checking something," Marcus replied, but his voice had taken on a different quality. He moved to get his magnifying lamp, the one he used for precision work around the ears and neckline, and positioned it to get a clear view of the area. What Marcus saw through the magnified lens made his blood run cold. The bump wasn't just raised. It had an irregular, mottled appearance with areas of different coloration. The edges were asymmetrical, and there appeared to be some kind of surface irregularity that looked almost like scaling or crusting. Marcus had seen plenty of skin abnormalities in his years as a barber, but he'd also learned enough from his father and grandfather to know when something looked serious. More importantly, this bump was located exactly where Harold had been experiencing his most severe headaches. "Mr. Whitman," Marcus said carefully, "how long have you had this bump?" "What bump?" Harold asked, confusion evident in his voice. "I didn't know there was a bump." Eleanor had always been the one to check Harold's back and scalp for anything unusual, a holdover from her nursing days when she'd learned to look for skin changes that patients might miss. But with all the stress of Harold's medical battles and her secret job at Peterson's Market, those routine checks had fallen by the wayside. "Frank, Pete, come over here," Marcus said quietly. "I want you to see this." The two men approached Harold's chair, and Marcus showed them what he'd discovered. Frank, who had worked construction for over 40 years and had seen his share of work-related skin damage, whistled low under his breath. "Harold, that doesn't look right," Pete said with characteristic bluntness. "That looks like something that needs to be seen by a doctor. A real doctor, not one of these jokers who's been blowing you off." Harold's headache was intensifying, but through the pain, he felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in months: validation. These men, his friends and peers, were taking his symptoms seriously and treating him like his concerns mattered. "Can you feel it when I touch it?" Marcus asked, gently probing the area with the tip of his comb. "No," Harold replied, which alarmed Marcus even more. A bump that size should have some sensation, especially when touched. The lack of feeling suggested that whatever was happening might be affecting the nerves in that area. As Marcus continued his examination, Harold suddenly gasped and gripped the chair arms with both hands. This headache was different from all the others, more intense, more focused, and accompanied by a wave of nausea that made him break out in a cold sweat. "Harold!" Frank called out, jumping to his feet. "I'm okay," Harold managed to say, but he clearly wasn't. His face had gone pale and beads of perspiration were forming on his forehead, despite the barbershop's air conditioning. Marcus made a decision that would later be credited with saving Harold's life. Instead of accepting Harold's dismissal of the symptoms, the way 3 different doctors had done, he chose to trust his instincts and act on what he was seeing. "Mr. Whitman, I need to call someone," Marcus said firmly. "Call who?" Harold asked through gritted teeth. 911. This bump, combined with your headaches and what just happened, something's seriously wrong, and it needs immediate medical attention. Harold's first instinct was to protest. The cost of an ambulance, the expense of an emergency room visit, the likelihood that he'd just be dismissed again, all of it ran through his mind in the few seconds before another wave of pain hit him. "Marcus is right," Pete said decisively. "Harold, this isn't the time to worry about money or insurance or any of that bureaucratic garbage. Something's wrong and we're getting you help." Frank was already moving toward the phone. "I'm calling Eleanor too. She needs to know what's happening." As Marcus dialed 911, Harold found himself overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and fear. These men, a barber and 2 retirees, were showing him more concern and taking more decisive action than multiple medical professionals had shown over the past 4 months. 911, what's your emergency? This is Marcus Thompson at Thompson's Traditional Barbershop on Main Street. I have a 74-year-old man who's been experiencing severe headaches for months, and I've just discovered what appears to be a significant skin abnormality on his scalp. He's currently experiencing severe pain and appears to be in medical distress. The dispatcher's questions were thorough and professional, and Marcus answered them with the same attention to detail he brought to his barbering. He described Harold's symptoms, the appearance of the bump, the pattern of headaches, and the fact that multiple doctors had previously dismissed Harold's concerns. "Sir, we're dispatching an ambulance now. Please stay on the line and continue to monitor the patient." Eleanor arrived at the barber shop before the ambulance, having received Frank's call while she was finishing her shift at Peterson's Market. She took one look at Harold, pale, sweating, gripping the chair like his life depended on it, and immediately shifted into the take-charge mode that had served her well during decades of dealing with medical emergencies at the elementary school. "Harold, can you hear me?" "How's the pain level?" she asked, automatically checking his pulse and looking for other signs of distress. "Bad, Ellie. Worse than it's ever been." Eleanor turned to Marcus. "Show me what you found." Marcus demonstrated how he'd discovered the bump and pointed out its concerning characteristics. Eleanor's nursing experience immediately told her that this was serious, possibly very serious. "Why didn't any of the doctors find this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. None of them had actually examined Harold's scalp thoroughly. They'd been too focused on dismissing his symptoms to perform a comprehensive physical examination. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes after Marcus's call, and the EMTs quickly assessed Harold's condition. What happened next was a stark contrast to Harold's previous medical experiences. The EMTs listened carefully to Marcus's description of what he'd found, documented the location and appearance of the bump, and treated Harold's pain as a legitimate medical emergency rather than the complaints of an overly anxious elderly man. "Sir, we're going to get you to the hospital and have this properly evaluated," the lead EMT told Harold as they prepared to transport him. "Your friend here did exactly the right thing by calling us." As Harold was wheeled out of the barber shop on a stretcher, he managed to catch Marcus's eye. "Thank you," he said simply. But those two words carried the weight of months of frustration, fear, and hope. Marcus watched the ambulance pull away, then turned to clean up his station. The haircut had never been finished, but that was the least important thing that had happened in his barber shop that afternoon. As he swept up the hair clippings and put away his tools, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something significant. Not just the discovery of Harold's medical problem, but a demonstration of what could happen when people refused to accept inadequate care for those they valued. Frank and Pete remained in the shop, both men quiet as they processed what they had just witnessed. "You know what this means, don't you?" Frank said finally. "What's that?" Marcus asked. "It means we were right. All of us who've been dismissed, ignored, told our problems are just part of getting old. We were right. There really is something wrong with how they're treating us." Pete nodded grimly. "Question is, how many others are out there right now, suffering through something serious while their doctors tell them it's normal aging?" As the three men contemplated that sobering question, Harold was already on his way to an emergency room where his case would finally receive the urgent attention it had always deserved. But the real discovery that day wasn't just medical. It was the realization that sometimes the most important advocacy comes not from medical professionals, but from ordinary people who refuse to accept that anyone deserves to suffer in silence. The emergency room at Millbrook General Hospital had seen Harold Whitman before, twice in the past 4 months, both times for headaches that had been classified as non-urgent, and treated with the kind of perfunctory attention reserved for elderly patients with vague complaints. This time was different. The EMT's report mentioned a concerning skin lesion discovered by a barber, documented Harold's severe pain episodes, and noted the pattern of symptoms that had been dismissed by multiple physicians. For the first time in months, Harold was being taken seriously as a medical case, rather than dismissed as an anxious senior. But the emergency room system that July afternoon was operating at capacity, and even with the EMT's detailed report, Harold found himself in triage for over 2 hours. Eleanor sat beside his gurney in the crowded hallway, holding his hand and watching the constant flow of medical staff who seemed too busy to make eye contact, let alone provide updates on Harold's condition. "Mrs. Whitman?" A young resident finally approached them at 6:30 p.m., clipboard in hand and the harried expression of someone who had been working for 18 straight hours. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Tom's daughter-in-law. My father-in-law called me and asked me to check on your husband personally." The connection to their barbershop support network immediately changed the dynamic. Dr. Chen wasn't just another overworked resident dealing with another elderly patient. She was part of their community, someone who understood that Harold was a respected member of Millbrook who deserved careful attention. "Doctor, thank you for coming," Eleanor said, relief evident in her voice. "Harold's been in so much pain and the headaches have been getting worse for months. Doctor." Chen began the kind of thorough examination that Harold hadn't received since his symptoms started. She listened carefully to his description of the headaches, noted their frequency and intensity, and most importantly, examined the bump that Marcus had discovered with the attention it deserved. "Mr. Whitman, I need to be honest with you," Dr. Chen said after several minutes of careful examination. "This lesion is concerning. It has several characteristics that suggest it could be a malignant melanoma, and its location corresponds exactly with where you've been experiencing your headaches." The words hit Harold and Eleanor like physical blows. Melanoma, skin cancer, was something that happened to other people, to those who had spent decades in the sun without protection. Harold had worked indoors at the steel mill for most of his career. How could he have developed skin cancer? "Doctor, how is that possible?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. "Harold's hardly been in the sun. Melanoma can develop anywhere on the body, Mrs. Whitman, and unfortunately, scalp melanomas are particularly dangerous because they're often detected late. The hair makes it difficult to spot changes, and the symptoms can be mistaken for other conditions, like tension headaches or stress-related pain. Dr. Chen ordered an immediate CT scan and arranged for Harold to be seen by the hospital's dermatology team first thing in the morning. But even as she worked to get Harold the care he needed, she was battling the same insurance authorization requirements that had plagued his previous attempts to receive adequate medical attention. "The insurance company is requiring pre-authorization for the CT scan," she told Eleanor after spending 45 minutes on the phone with various departments. "They're saying that since Mr. Whitman is over 70 and the symptoms have been present for months, this doesn't qualify as an emergency requiring immediate imaging." Eleanor felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had sustained her through months of watching her husband suffer while bureaucrats and insurance executives made medical decisions from their offices hundreds of miles away. "Doctor, if you suspected a younger person had melanoma, would you wait for insurance authorization before doing a CT scan?" "Absolutely not," Dr. Chen replied without hesitation. "Then don't wait for authorization now. We'll figure out how to pay for it." Harold, despite his pain, tried to protest. "Ellie, we can't afford. Harold Whitman, we can't afford not to. I don't care if we have to mortgage the house, sell everything we own, or spend the rest of our lives paying medical bills. We're getting you the care you need, and we're getting it tonight, Dr. Chen made the decision that would later be seen as a turning point in Harold's case. She ordered the CT scan without insurance authorization, noting in Harold's medical record that the delay posed an immediate threat to the patient's health, and that the hospital would absorb the cost if the insurance company refused to pay. The CT scan results were available within 2 hours, and they confirmed Dr. Chen's worst fears. Harold had an advanced melanoma that had not only grown to a significant size, but had also begun to metastasize, sending cancer cells into his lymph nodes and potentially to other parts of his body. More alarmingly, the tumor was pressing against his skull in a way that explained the severe headaches and could soon cause even more serious neurological complications. "How long do I have?" Harold asked when Dr. Chen delivered the news, his voice steady despite the devastating diagnosis. "Mr. Whitman, that depends on how quickly we can get you into treatment. With immediate and aggressive intervention, melanoma can be successfully treated even at this stage, but we need to move fast." The next revelation was almost as devastating as the cancer diagnosis itself. The treatment Harold would need, surgery to remove the tumor, possible radiation therapy, and ongoing oncological care, would cost approximately $347,000. Medicare would cover roughly 60% of the costs, leaving Harold and Eleanor responsible for nearly $140,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. "Doctor," Eleanor said quietly, "we're living on Social Security. Our entire annual income is less than what we'd owe after insurance." Dr. Chen had delivered similar news to other elderly patients, and she knew that the American healthcare system's failure to adequately cover cancer treatment for seniors was forcing families to make impossible choices every day. Some patients chose to forego treatment rather than bankrupt their families. Others exhausted their life savings and still couldn't afford the full course of care they needed. "Mrs. Whitman, there are some programs that might help. Social workers who specialize in finding financial assistance for cancer patients, foundations that provide grants, payment plans that can spread the costs over time. But I won't lie to you, it's going to be a battle." Harold closed his eyes and tried to process the information. 4 months ago, he had been a healthy retiree looking forward to spending his golden years with Eleanor, maybe traveling to visit David in California, continuing his woodworking hobby, and enjoying the community connections he'd built over decades in Millbrook. Now he was facing a cancer diagnosis that would either kill him or bankrupt his family, possibly both. "There's something else you need to know," Dr. Chen continued gently. "Based on the size and characteristics of this tumor and the timeline you've described for your symptoms, this melanoma has been growing for at least a year, possibly longer. If it had been detected and treated 6 months ago, the prognosis would have been much better, and the treatment would have been far less extensive and expensive." The implication was clear. The multiple doctors who had dismissed Harold's headaches as normal aging had missed a window of opportunity when his cancer could have been treated more easily and successfully. Their failure to take his symptoms seriously hadn't just caused months of unnecessary suffering, it had potentially cost Harold years of his life. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, a sound like glass shattering that no one else could hear. The man she had loved for 52 years was facing a life-threatening illness that might have been prevented if the medical system had simply listened to him and taken his concerns seriously. "Doctor," she said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her, "what do we do now?" "Now we fight," Dr. Chen replied. "We get Mr. Whitman the treatment he needs, and we figure out how to make the system work for him instead of against him." As Harold was admitted to the hospital for overnight observation and preparation for the next day's surgical consultation, Eleanor called David in California with the news that would bring their family face to face with the brutal realities of American healthcare. But she also called Marcus at the barber shop, knowing that the Silver Brigade would want to know that their advocacy had quite literally saved Harold's life. The battle for Harold's survival was just beginning, but for the first time in months he wasn't fighting alone. 1 week after Harold's devastating diagnosis, as he lay in his hospital bed awaiting the surgery that might save his life, Marcus Thompson walked into the room carrying a bouquet of flowers from his barbershop's window box and a secret that had weighed on his heart for 23 years. Harold looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital gown and the maze of IV tubes, but his eyes were clear and alert as Marcus approached. "Marcus, you didn't need to come," Harold said, though his voice carried genuine warmth. "You've already done more for me than I can ever repay." "Mr. Whitman?" Marcus said, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "That's actually what I came to talk to you about. You see, you already have repaid me. You repaid me a long time ago, and you don't even remember it." Eleanor looked up from her knitting. She'd been working on the same scarf for 3 days, her hands needing something to do while her mind processed the enormity of Harold's situation. "What do you mean, Marcus?" Marcus pulled the visitor's chair closer to Harold's bed and sat down heavily, as if the story he was about to tell carried physical weight. "Mr. Whitman, do you remember December 15th, 1999? It was a Thursday, snowing pretty hard, around 6 o'clock in the evening." Harold's brow furrowed as he tried to access memories that had become increasingly unreliable. "I'm sorry, son. These days I have trouble remembering what I had for breakfast, let alone something from 24 years ago." "You were driving home from work," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the careful cadence of someone recounting a story that had been replayed in his mind countless times. "There was a car accident at the intersection of Mill Creek Road and Highway 9. A pickup truck ran a red light and hit a small sedan. The sedan caught fire." Eleanor's knitting needles had stopped moving. Something in Marcus's tone suggested this wasn't just any story. This was the story, the one that would explain everything. "There were 2 people in that sedan," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Harold's face. "A 30-year-old man and his 15-year-old son. The impact had jammed the doors, and with the fire spreading, they were trapped inside." Harold was listening intently now, something flickering behind his eyes, not quite memory, but recognition of something important. "Witnesses said you didn't hesitate. You pulled over, grabbed a tire iron from your truck and smashed the passenger side window. You pulled the boy out first, then went back for his father, even though the flames were getting worse. You burned your hands pretty badly getting that man out of the car. Marcus paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. Mr. Whitman, I was that 15-year-old boy, and that man you saved was my father, Jerome Thompson. The silence in the hospital room was complete except for the steady beeping of Harold's heart monitor. Eleanor's knitting had fallen to her lap, and Harold was staring at Marcus with an expression of wonder and confusion. I don't remember, Harold said quietly. I wish I did, but I don't remember. The doctors think the early signs of cognitive changes might be affecting some of your older memories, Marcus explained gently. But Mr. Whitman, I remember everything. I remember you kneeling beside me in the snow, checking to make sure I wasn't hurt. I remember you telling me, every young person deserves a chance to grow up. That's what we're here for, to make sure the next generation gets their shot. Eleanor was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. This was her Harold, the man who would risk his own safety to help strangers, who believed in protecting and nurturing young people, who saw every act of service as part of a larger responsibility to his community. My father survived that night because of you, Marcus continued. He had some broken ribs and a concussion, but he recovered completely. He lived for another 18 years. Got to see me graduate from barber school, got to walk me down the aisle at my wedding, got to hold his first grandchild. 18 years he wouldn't have had if you hadn't stopped to help. Harold's eyes were filling with tears, though he still couldn't access the specific memory Marcus was describing. What happened to your father? Heart attack in 2017. But Mr. Whitman, those 18 extra years you gave us were precious beyond measure. And when Dad was dying, do you know what he told me? He said, son, there's a man in this town named Harold Whitman who saved our lives once. If you ever get the chance to help him, you take it. You pay forward what he gave us. The pieces were falling into place now. Marcus's decision to take over his family's barber shop in Millbrook instead of moving to a bigger city where he could have made more money. His particular attention to elderly customers, especially Harold. His willingness to turn the barbershop into a healthcare advocacy center. His immediate recognition that Harold's symptoms were serious and his quick action to get help. Marcus, Eleanor said through her tears, you've been taking care of Harold all these years because 24 years ago he took care of us when we needed it most. And Mr. Whitman, when I saw you suffering, when I saw how the medical system was dismissing you and treating you like your life didn't matter, I knew it was time to pay that debt. Harold reached out with a shaking hand, and Marcus took it gently. Son, you don't owe me anything. Yes, I do, Marcus replied firmly. But more than that, you deserve to be helped simply because you're a good man who's contributed to this community for 74 years. You deserve to be heard, to be taken seriously, to receive the best medical care available regardless of your age or insurance status. The emotional revelation was interrupted by the arrival of David Whitman, who had flown in from California the day after receiving Eleanor's call about his father's diagnosis. David looked exhausted and stressed, carrying the weight of cross-country travel, work responsibilities he'd had to abandon, and the crushing realization that his father might be dying. Dad, how are you feeling? David asked, kissing Harold's forehead before embracing Eleanor. Better now that you're here, Harold replied. David, I want you to meet Marcus Thompson. He's the man who saved my life. As Marcus recounted his story for David, the younger man listened with growing amazement and gratitude. Here was a stranger who had been quietly caring for his parents, who had recognized his father's medical crisis when multiple doctors had failed, who had acted decisively to get Harold the help he needed. Marcus, I don't know how to thank you, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Just help us figure out how to get your father the treatment he needs, Marcus replied. That's all the thanks I want. The conversation that followed revealed the true scope of the Whitman family's financial crisis. David, despite his successful career in software engineering, was not in the financial position his parents had assumed. His recent divorce had cost him half his assets, his children's college tuition was consuming much of his income, and the California real estate market had left him house-rich but cash-poor. "Dad, I've been trying to figure out how to help," David admitted. "I could take out a second mortgage, maybe liquidate some retirement savings, but honestly, even if I did all that, I couldn't come close to covering your treatment costs." Harold felt the familiar despair settling over him. Even with his son's help, even with Eleanor's secret job, even with whatever insurance would cover, the financial reality of cancer treatment in America was going to destroy everything his family had worked for over decades. "Maybe," Harold said quietly, "maybe it's time to consider that some fights aren't worth winning if they leave the people you love with nothing." "Harold Whitman, don't you dare," Eleanor said with fierce determination. "We're not giving up. Ellie, be realistic. We're talking about more money than we could earn in 5 years. What kind of life would you have if we spent everything on keeping me alive for maybe a few more years?" Marcus had been listening to this exchange with growing distress. The man who had once risked his life to save strangers was now contemplating letting himself die to protect his family's financial security. The cruel mathematics of American healthcare were forcing a good man to weigh his own life against his love for his wife and son. "Mr. Whitman," Marcus said suddenly, "what if I told you there might be another way?" "What do you mean?" Marcus explained what had been happening at the barbershop since Harold's hospitalization. Word of Harold's situation had spread throughout Millbrook's tight-knit community, and the response had been extraordinary. The Silver Brigade had organized a fundraising campaign that was unlike anything the small town had ever seen. Ruth Patterson, despite her own financial struggles, had donated $200, her weekly grocery money. Frank Morrison had organized the other mill retirees to contribute from their pension funds. The Sacred Heart congregation had taken up a special collection. Even Tom Peterson had closed his market for an hour to allow his employees to make phone calls to their own networks of family and friends. "Mr. Whitman, in 5 days, this community has raised $47,000 for your medical expenses. It's not enough to cover everything, but it's a start." And the local newspaper picked up the story. It's starting to spread beyond Millbrook. David was staring at Marcus in amazement. $47,000? From your neighbors? "From people who know that Harold Whitman is worth fighting for," Marcus replied. "And this is just the beginning. We're not going to let you face this alone." As Harold absorbed this news, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his diagnosis. Hope. Not just for his medical treatment, but for the realization that his life had mattered to his community in ways he had never fully understood. The man who had spent decades serving others was finally discovering the depth of love and respect he had earned. But even as this community support began to address the financial crisis, Harold's medical situation remained critical. The surgery scheduled for the following day would determine whether the cancer could be successfully removed, and even with the best possible outcome, he faced months of difficult treatment and an uncertain prognosis. The battle for Harold's life was far from over, but for the first time since his diagnosis, he wasn't fighting it alone. 18 months later, Harold Whitman stood in the same barbershop where his life had been saved, but everything else had changed. The silver hair that Marcus carefully trimmed now grew over a barely visible scar, where advanced melanoma had once threatened to end his life. The headaches that had plagued him for months were gone, replaced by the clear thinking that came with proper medical treatment and the knowledge that he was truly valued by his community. Thompson's traditional barbershop bore little resemblance to the quiet neighborhood establishment it had once been. The walls now displayed framed newspaper articles about Harold's case, photographs from fundraising events, and a plaque designating the shop as the headquarters of the Harold Whitman Senior Healthcare Advocacy Fund, a foundation that had grown from a local grassroots effort into a nationally recognized organization fighting for elderly patients' rights. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Whitman?" Marcus asked as he guided Harold into the familiar second chair from the window, the same spot where a barber's trained eye had spotted what 3 doctors had missed. "Like a man who's been given a second chance," Harold replied, his voice strong and clear. The surgery had been successful, removing the entire tumor and the affected lymph nodes. The follow-up treatments had been grueling but effective, and Harold's latest scans showed no signs of cancer recurrence. Eleanor sat in the waiting area, no longer the exhausted woman who had worked secret shifts to pay for medical bills. The community fundraising had ultimately raised over $200,000, enough to cover Harold's treatment costs and establish the advocacy fund that now helped other seniors navigate healthcare challenges. Her husband's near-death experience had taught her that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a recognition of the bonds that hold communities together. David had made the decision to move back to Ohio permanently, taking a position with a tech company in Columbus that allowed him to work remotely 3 days a week. His house was now just 2 blocks from his parents, close enough for daily visits and Sunday dinners, but far enough for independence. The crisis that had nearly torn their family apart had ultimately brought them closer together than they'd been in decades. "Dad," David said, arriving for his own weekly appointment, "the congressional hearing is confirmed for next month. Senator Williams wants you to testify about Medicare gaps in cancer coverage." Harold nodded with quiet satisfaction. His case had become a symbol of the healthcare system's failure to adequately serve elderly Americans, and the Whitman Amendment to Medicare legislation was working its way through Congress with bipartisan support. As Marcus finished Harold's haircut, the afternoon sun streamed through the barbershop windows, illuminating the community bulletin board covered with success stories from other seniors who had received help through their advocacy network. Harold stood and looked around the shop that had become so much more than a place to get haircuts. It had become proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept that anyone should suffer alone. "You know what I learned through all this?" Harold said to Marcus as he prepared to leave. "What's that, Mr. Whitman? Getting old isn't about giving up. It's about using every year of wisdom and experience to make sure the next person doesn't have to face what you faced alone." Harold walked out into the Millbrook afternoon, holding Eleanor's hand, knowing that every day was a gift, not just because he had survived cancer, but because he had discovered that a life spent serving others creates a community that will serve you in return. Sometimes the best medicine doesn't come from a hospital. Sometimes it comes from the heart of a barber who remembers that every person deserves to be heard and every life deserves to be fought for. Harold's story could be your story or your spouse's or your neighbor's. At 74, he was dismissed by doctors who saw his age before they saw his pain. His headaches were called normal aging, while melanoma grew silently beneath his silver hair. Sound familiar? How many times have you left a doctor's office feeling unheard, your concerns brushed aside with, "It's just part of getting older"? Harold nearly died because our healthcare system treats seniors as expired warranties rather than human beings with decades of wisdom and contribution. But here's what changed everything. Marcus, a barber who truly listened, not a doctor with fancy degrees, but a man who cared enough to look closely when everyone else looked away. Harold's salvation came from community, neighbors who rallied, friends who fundraised, and ordinary people who refused to let a good man suffer alone. Today, Harold is cancer-free, his family is united, and his advocacy has helped thousands of seniors get the care they deserve. Your voice matters. Your pain is real. Your life has value that no insurance company can calculate. You deserve to be heard, respected, and cared for with the same urgency given to younger patients. What healthcare dismissals have you experienced because of your age? Have you ever had a non-medical professional notice something doctors missed? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help another senior feel less alone.